Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode 6. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Colby Salerno. I am here with my co-host, Dr. Alin Gregosian.
Hi. We're glad to be back.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who's still listening. I know we took some time off. Alin was traveling and working nights, and I was stuck working in the CCU, so we really didn't have time to come record, but we're excited to be here recording today. We are today going to be talking about interviewing for medical school, residency, and fellowship. For those that are not in the medical field, right now is interview season. And there's a lot of people in medical training out there who are currently applying for either for residency or fellowship or advanced fellowship. And a lot of them go through the electronic residency application services, ERAS as it's called in the medical field. And it's a very stressful time for everyone. And so we kind of wanted to talk about today how I approached it, having already had a known medical illness, disability, and how I kind of thought about this as I was applying for medicine. And although we're going to be talking about this for the medical field, a lot of this might be applied to just anyone out there as they apply for jobs. And hopefully, if you're on the other side of this, if you're the people who are interviewing for these spots, you can kind of hear how people might be concerned about disclosing too much information.
Yeah, and as far as my perspective, so when I was applying to college and medical school and residency and fellowship, like I never had my disability at that time. So now that I'm actually looking for jobs, I don't know what to do, and I'm kind of unsure about how to go about it. And so I actually always ask Colby for advice about this. And so, at this point, I've kind of figured out what I should probably be doing. And so we're going to talk about that. But at the same time, I'll tell you guys about what I've been asking Colby.
Yeah. So for me, when I was applying for medical school, I had recently had my heart transplant. And then, of course, as I applied for residency and fellowship, it had just become a part of who I was. And I didn't really think about how people might perceive me having a heart transplant, especially until I was in residency. And then really specifically as I was applying for fellowship. When I applied for med school, I felt like it was such a bonus, I guess you could say. I think it was a very big strength of mine to have had a heart transplant and to have lived in a hospital for so long. I felt like it gave me such a unique perspective. And so, of course, when I'm applying for med school, that was the bulk of my personal statement is what I've been through and how I can use what I've been through to be a better physician. And so I can't say for sure, but I do think it helped me in terms of my medical school personal statement. And I really think it helped me the day that I interviewed at the medical school that I ended up getting into, because I think it resonated with the two physicians that were interviewing me that day. As for residency, once I got to residency and I realized how demanding the job can be at times, and how if you are out of work for an extended period of time, that the bulk of the work that needs to be done falls upon your co-residents. And so I started to think, man, if I ended up being out for my transplant or something, would I be putting a ton of work on other people? And does that cross the mind of program directors as they start to think about who would be good for a residency spot?
Right. The guilt trip.
Exactly. The big guilt trip that, people can go through. And I think we said this before, Alin and I, when we were talking about the podcast, how we would never think this way about anyone else. If they truly need to be out, we would step in and help them. But yet when it's us who needs to step away, we think oh my God, we're putting so much work on other people. And I know, there are laws in place and, discrimination laws to make sure you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. But I think there's ways around that. And when I was applying for fellowship, it was during COVID, and there was this concern that I was immunocompromised. And I think people did have some fears about me missing time or being in a hospital, and who would pick up the work if I were to have to not be in the hospital due to the pandemic. And I can't say for sure, but I do believe that there was a program director out there who made a subtle comment about it. And I just remember being like, did I make a mistake making my personal statement again about my heart transplant and how it could be such a strength of mine in terms of working in cardiology? But in the
But
end,
at the same time, like, would you want to be at a place that had a program director that like would make a comment like that?
definitely not. And so now I definitely, after I've kind of been through this process, I now have strong opinions about this. And my belief, I feel deeply that if you feel what you've been through medically makes you better at the job that you are applying for, and if somebody doesn't want you because of that, you shouldn't want to be at that program. So I wholeheartedly now believe that I wouldn't want to be at a program that felt maybe it was a disadvantage that I had a transplant. I would want to only be somewhere where they saw it as a strength and a bonus of me having been through this and seeing what I can add to a program with this unique perspective.
Right, exactly. That's kind of the way that I think I see it, and I hope. Like, I don't know if we're being naive or anything, and I don't know if we're being super hopeful about this, but that's kind of the way that I see it too. So now that I'm in the job application process and I'm trying to look for jobs, first of all, I've been very open about my transplant since day one. And I remember people even asking me, like people as in my colleagues asking me like, you're open about your heart transplant on Twitter. Like, are you worried about potential hospitals seeing it? Are you worried about potential like, employers seeing it? And I was like, I didn't even think about that, to be honest. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, and if they are going to see it, then so be it, because I would only want to be working at a place that was okay with me having my disability. Although at the same time, you have to know that there, our heart transplants, there are things that we can't do necessarily. Like, for example, with the whole COVID pandemic, obviously, when it comes down to seeing the patients who are COVID positive, I'm not going to be able to intubate those patients. But if I have a plan in place for somebody who can, so if I'm always on with another physician who's going to be able to intubate for me, which is usually the case in the emergency department or the ICU. So I feel like if I were to even bring it up, and if I was even a little bit self-conscious about bringing it up and I was unsure, maybe if I had a plan like to the person that I was interviewing with, maybe that would make it better. I don't know. Again, I don't know the answer to this. I'm just saying I was just like brainstorming at that time.
Yeah, and
So
I don't.
yeah.
I was just gonna say, at this point, you and I don't have a choice, right? A quick Google search of our names, and people are gonna know we've had heart transplants. So, I guess these recommendations would be for everyone outside of us who is not easily is Googleable a word, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Exactly. Like all they have to do is write in my first name into Google and everything pops up. So it doesn't even matter. But yeah, and like a lot of people will tell me they'll be, a lot of people will say like, it's so nice that you're a doctor who's been through it all and you can connect with patients and blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, like, are you going to be able to be a good doctor? Like that's ultimately what really matters. And, are you clinically proficient enough to get the job done? And honestly, like that is a lot of what matters. And I'd like to think that I am. It's not just my heart transplant, but there's a lot of, schooling that we did, and there's a lot more to me than just my heart transplant too, that I'll bring to the table. I was listening to a podcast that basically brought up the notion of when you're talking about your disability and whether or not you want to disclose it. First of all, it should be completely up to you whether or not you want to disclose it to your employer. And when you want to disclose it is also up to you, if you ever want to disclose it. But the way that one of the hosts was talking about it was she was saying something like, I think that if you think of it like it's your personality, you're not necessarily going to be open about every single part of your personality right on day one of your job interview. But sometimes little things about you are going to come out throughout you working at a place. So again, if you think of it maybe like that, maybe eventually they'll find out about your heart transplant, or maybe you're not comfortable with them finding out about your disability now, but you know that you'll eventually bring it up. Again, it's up to you. Personally, I think at this point, I am going to bring it up in all my interviews. And even if I don't, my name's everywhere. But again, I like to think that if I'm at a place I want them to know everything that I've been through. And if they're not okay with it, then I don't even want to work there.
I completely agree. And I think it's easy for me to say now, having been able to match into residency and match into fellowship, that, it was easy for me to disclose it because I got to where I wanted to be. But this is such a stressful time for med students and residents and fellows. You are putting your name into a computer system. You're hoping to get enough interviews to make yourself competitive. And again, for those not in the medical field, the way this works is you get a certain number of interviews, you interview for these programs, and then you rank the programs from first to whatever, number you've been able to get interviews at. And you say, like, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. And the programs then rank you, and they rank all the people they interviewed, and it just goes into an algorithm. And the next 3, 4, 5 years of your life depend on this algorithm. And all of a sudden you get an email telling you that this is where you're going to be going for the next few years of your training. And the stress that comes with this it's kind of crazy. And I can't think of a better way to do this, but anyone who's been through this process knows how crazy and intense this is. So the stress on top of that, to think, should I say, oh, I've had a transplant, and, will that just somehow sit the wrong way? And it doesn't even have to be transplant. It could be really, anything that you feel is important to you as who you are as a physician, whether it's you've battled cancer or you're immunocompromised for another reason, but you think it's important to share, but you're scared to share it. I think a lot of people would agree that this is a big stress. And I think I stick by, though, that you should share it. Ironically, though, I feel like if I wasn't in medicine, I wouldn't share it. So if I was like just applying for a regular business job or anything, I would never share that I had a heart transplant. I only share it in the field of medicine because I think it makes me a better doctor. And I don't know if you feel the same way, Alin.
Yeah, I do. I was actually going to ask you that, if you would have shared it if it was another job. But also, a big part of you, the reason why you went into medicine was because of your heart disease in the first place. So I guess, like, if you weren't in medicine, would you share it? Well, it has nothing to do with your job at that point, right?
Exactly.
So,
what
yeah.
point would I have in sharing at that point? And then for sure, I would want to make sure that I'm not going to be discriminated against. And so, like I said, although it's illegal, I would still want to protect myself, and I would not share it at all if I was not applying for this particular job.
I think I still would, again, just because I would want to be in a place that would be okay with me having my heart transplant. Again, a lot of people don't know, like, because heart transplant is kind of more of an invisible illness, right? Like, people don't understand when I say I have a disability. Sure, I look fine, like, from the outside, or I think I look fine. There's parts of me that always, I'm like, how does it mean? What does it mean by I have a disability? So you have to remember that by that, it means that I'm taking, couple days off here and there to get blood drawn. Sometimes I get sick and I have to call off work. Sometimes this happens, sometimes that happens. And I think no matter what kind of career I was to go into, that was going to happen nonetheless. So I would still want my employer to know about my heart transplant. So I think I'd still be open about it. But again, I think everybody's different. So I totally understand that people aren't as open, and I don't think anybody should be forced into it. And that's the whole point of the ADA Act. Like, it's not anything that should be forced, and it's not something that you need to disclose because you're forced into it, because you're asked about it. You should absolutely never be asked about it, by the way. That's, like, definitely illegal.
Definitely. So I think for the most part, we're on the same page here. We think especially in medicine, we feel it's important to share it. We think it's important to get to a program that sees it as a strength and not a weakness. That being said, you applied for emergency medicine and critical care prior to all this. So my question for you is, for anyone who's listening, who's a med student or a resident, and they're in the ERAS process right now, what recommendations would you give, having now matched into 2 competitive specialties?
So I did keep in mind, this was a few years ago, so things were, like, a little bit different then. EM is a lot more focused on doing OA rotations and getting your letter of recommendations by good programs or by programs in general. I went to medical school in Tennessee at Lincoln Memorial University at DCOM. And after that, I tried to do as many away rotations in emergency medicine as possible. And I tried to get strong letter of recommendations from people that I thought I had impressed. So, I had average, like I had a little bit, like I think my step one was like average and my step two was maybe a little bit above average, but they weren't like anything super crazy. But I did get good letters of rec. I had a lot of extracurriculars. I had done some research. So I had some things that were a little bit different than most, even though I didn't have necessarily the best scores on my tests. And so I think if you can get the good letters, if you can stand out in that way, or get as many letters from as many different programs and rotate at the places. And then I know that when you're interviewing, I guess it's a little bit different now because it's COVID, and I know most places are still just doing Zoom interviews. But once we go back to doing like regular interviews, if you're interested in a place, it's always nice to go back and do a second look. Go back to the hospital, ask if you can like shadow for a day. That always makes it well known that you're very interested in the program. And the program directors and program leadership are, they see that. I think overall, if you show your genuine enthusiasm in a program and you show your genuine enthusiasm in emergency medicine and you try to stand out in a tiny way, I know we're all the same type A, physicians. I think that's all you need. But yeah, I mean, emergency medicine at that time was pretty competitive, but I think it's getting a little more competitive as the years go by. When I wanted to do critical care, like I chose my EM programs based on how much time we had in the ICU because I already kind of knew that I wanted to go into critical care. So I had like one of my top choices was Drexel University's program. And the way I chose it as one of my top programs was because of how much time we spent in the ICU as emergency medicine residents. So I suggest also prioritizing what you want in a program. So for me, it was, how many residents match into critical care and location. Like I wanted to be on the East Coast. I wanted to be in big city. I wanted a level 1 trauma center. I wanted good critical care. I didn't care about anything else. Like I wasn't somebody who wanted to live in a big house. I wasn't somebody who wanted necessarily like everybody has different things that they want. Those were things that I wanted. So after that, I matched there, and then my intern year, I started doing as much critical care time as possible. And I started doing research. And then, I applied early second year for my critical care fellowship. I ended up liking the program that I'm in right now. I actually loved it. And the only thing I could tell you as to why I loved it more than the other programs was I just felt like I fit in. Like I just loved the people. I loved the fellows that we had interviewed with. I loved the faculty who I still love. And nothing else. It was just by intuition that I loved this place. So yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up doing my journey. And I worked really hard in residency. I mean, critical care was definitely not an easy fellowship to get into, especially with emergency medicine, because it's mostly internal medicine people who go into it. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, you can always email me with your specific questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I completely agree with everything you said. The only thing I would expand upon is I think the best way to at least get into residency, get into fellowship, is to be strong, to be a strong med student. And to get into fellowship, you need to be a strong resident. And I know a lot of people put so much on research and things like that, but I think it resonates with your program leadership when they can see you be strong just in your current position. And I think they will go to bat for you in terms of when you go to try and apply to higher levels. At least that's how I felt, because I too, I don't have a lot of research. I don't have the best test scores, but I worked really hard and I felt like I made really good relationships in residency. And I just felt like that resonated with not only the program leadership in internal medicine, but also the people that I worked with in cardiology. And it just made it such a nice, smooth transition for me to stay at my current hospital for internal medicine and then to just stay there for cardiology, just because I loved the place. It felt like home. And I think people understood that I was going to work hard in any position that I was put in.
Yeah, definitely. Even now, I'm sure, I mean, you work with residents and med students now. Like, the one thing that I always say is I don't care about how smart someone is. I care about how hard they work. And you can easily tell how hard a med student and a resident work, even just by working with them. With one day of working with someone, you can tell like how hardworking they are. I don't know about you. And that's all I care about. If you're hardworking, I don't care how smart you are, how many questions you answer correctly. Like, it's just about how hard you work and how well you stand out from there.
I completely agree. And I think it's now that I'm in fellowship, it's clear to the fellows that are a year or two above me that that's what they're looking for in terms of when the program leadership asks them about who they want to have come into the program. It's always going to be about people that work hard because they know that that'll make the job, it takes the stress off of them. So anytime, just for example, if you have 8 consults come in at night and your co-fellow is only able to see 2 of them because they're, I want to say lazy, but maybe they're lazy and they only see 2, that leaves a lot of work for you when you come in the morning. So I think that's one of the things that I think will get you further than board scores or research, is people seeing that you're going to work hard and that you are eager to learn.
Yeah, I totally agree.
All right. So I think that's how we're going to wrap up this discussion. We would love to hear from other medical professionals or anyone who's really just had a disability and how they have dealt with applying for jobs. We're only 2 people and these are only just 2 opinions. So we'd love to have you interact with us on social media so that we can kind of get a further discussion and see how other people would approach their job application process.
Yeah, so it would be really nice to hear like how other people would approach the same process. So if there's any other immunocompromised people or people with disabilities out there who, have big careers going or are looking for jobs or anything, or even employers, like what exactly do you look for? So email us, let us know how you feel about this topic. It'll be really interesting to find out.
Additionally, the last time that we had our episode, we said that we would start answering listeners' questions. So we're going to start doing that now at the end of episodes. So Alin has a great question from one of our listeners that I think was sent to us on social media.
Yeah, so I have a question from Courtney Ramirez. This was on through our Instagram, actually. So she asked it's a 2-part question. So what are things post-transplant that you can't do or need to be very careful doing that the general public might not really think about? In contrast, what are some things you can do with the transplant you maybe didn't think you would be able to do? And I get asked this all the time. I don't know about you.
Yeah, so you go ahead, answer first, and then I'll answer.
Post-transplant things that you can't do. So like post-transplant, you can't eat any raw foods. You can't eat sushi. And people don't think about that. Anything that's raw puts you at risk for listeria or bacterial infections. That also includes things like raw salad. So you have to like wash things really well, like vegetables and fruits. So you technically shouldn't be eating any fruits and vegetables that aren't washed or from restaurants unless you actually have washed it yourself. And that's something that like most people don't realize. And then at the same time, the other question I get asked are like, so like, can you run? Like people ask me that all the time. And I'm like, yeah, like I can, in fact, like right after my heart transplant, I was probably at the peak of my, like how athletic I was because I had so much energy from my steroids, like from prednisone, that I was like jogging every day. I was like doing planks all the time. I was doing 2 a day. So I remember like I was so fit after like within months, like a month after my heart transplant, I was super fit. I had abs. I was jogging. So your heart transplant, or at least heart transplant, and in general, most transplants, you're not limited to being a certain way as far as you exercise. You can do what you can do. There are limits, but the limits depend on your specific condition. So people always get surprised by that. I mean, my limits right now are have to do more with my joints. some of you guys know that I got joint replacements, than my heart. So
Yeah, so I think in terms of things that since transplant that I can't do, the raw foods is definitely up there. The other thing, it's not so much of a can't, but after transplant, you're due to the immunocompromised state, you're at higher risk of skin cancer. So really should avoid the sun. I've had three spots now since transplant that were skin cancer. Nothing serious, but thankfully I go to the dermatologist every year. And so I've gotten all three of those removed. And, being only in my 30s, that's a decent amount of skin cancer already in someone's life. So that's one thing. And as for other restrictions or things that I can do now, so from the age of 12 to 24, I couldn't even walk up a single staircase without feeling like I couldn't breathe. So then shortly after my transplant, I was able to run a 5K. I picked up skiing during my transplant. So for me, it was so much doors were actually opened in terms of things that I could do now that I got a new heart, which was really, really amazing. I became so much more active than I was prior to my transplant.
Yeah, and people are surprised, right? Like they're like, "But you have a heart transplant." I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's a new heart.
But I was in heart failure before. So yeah, exactly. For me, it was night and day in terms of my athletic abilities, I guess we could call it, or lack thereof.
Yeah. And then residency happened, so we're not fit anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I could definitely use more time in the gym.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do like 30 push-ups a day. That's it. In the call room.
Other than that, though, I feel like there's not much limitation in our lives. I'm having trouble actually thinking of further limitations.
Anytime people ask me, I'm always like, it takes me a while to think about it. I'm always like, yeah, I mean, you have to be careful of crowds. You have to be careful of like getting sick, which, I mean, it's stuff that there isn't like specific things that you actually like cannot do. I get asked this I get asked if I can like skydive, which I asked my doctor and he said, I don't see why not, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure we can.
We definitely can.
Like I don't know why we wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, the nurse practitioner who pretty much oversees my care for the most part at this point, she was like, I probably would prefer you didn't, just because. But I would say there's nothing physically limiting to us. Yeah. Our heart can handle that level of adrenaline.
Yeah. So. With that being said, if you're going to do anything, please consult with your doctor. Do not listen to me and Colby. So
yeah, definitely don't. Which gets us to the second question that we're going to tackle today. So this is from Steven, who sent us an email. He asked if after a successful heart transplant, is care standardized across all institutions, or are there different guiding principles for medication or follow-up care depending on what region you live in or where you're followed? Which is an awesome question, Stephen. And the answer is overall, the care is pretty standardized, but there's definitely unique things to every transplant center. For example, and it changes with time as we learn more, things change. So the number of biopsies and cardiac catheterizations that I got 9.5 years ago is different than what Alin got when she got her transplant. And I think a lot of people out there who have had heart transplants will understand like the terms AlloMap and AlloSure or heart care. If you combine them together, these different blood tests that we can use, different centers seem to start testing this specific blood test at different times and, decide on different ways of looking for, that our coronary arteries are open. So there's definitely some unique things per each center.
Yeah, I remember one of my friends started getting AlloMaps within a month and a half, 2 months of her transplant. And then I think I started maybe 6 months later, but then there's people who don't get it for a year. I think it depends on the person too, if they've had any rejection episodes but care is pretty standardized, like Colby said, but there are specific differences But some institutions, another one I noticed is like angiograms. Some centers like don't do any. Some centers do one every year, and I never know like how to go about that.
Yeah, I think it's hard for now that we've had people messaging us from all over the country. Stephen is from Iowa. It's like I can tell you what happened with me and what my center does, but that might not correlate to your center.
Yeah,
And the important thing to know is that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's not
exactly.
one place is right and one place is wrong. It's just, having worked now in the field, there's things that work, people realize work at their center. And so they kind of stick to it. And that, again, that doesn't mean it's right. It just means that that's their way of doing it. I think one
Exactly.
example I saw is some people were kept on prednisone for much longer than I was. And, if a heart transplant center feels like that's what works for them, then of course they're going to stick with it. So I think it's important that, especially for all transplants and all medical fields out there, there's a lot of Facebook groups, social media groups, and you'll hear people talk and say what they're doing, and other people will say, this is what I do. And I think it's important for everyone to realize that just because one place does it one way and another does it another way,
There's no need to compare.
do not compare. Just talk to your team. They are doing it for a reason, and it really is just for your health.
Yep. I agree.
So I think that's it for today. Thank you to everyone for listening.
So thanks for joining us this week on Both Sides of the Stethoscope. Again, feel free to email us at bothsidesofthestethoscope@gmail.com for any comments or questions that you guys have. Feel free to follow us at Both Sides of the Stethoscope on both Instagram and Twitter, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, everyone. Can't wait to talk to you again next week or in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We'll see what our schedule shows.
I think once a week or every other week is fine.
We're working at it, everyone. Stick with us.